Okay, we have started recording.
Hello, my name is Harry French, and I'm the program manager of the Climate-Wise Business Network here at the Windfall Ecology Center. I would like to introduce my colleague, Audrey Baines, who you just heard, and who's our technical coordinator for today's activity. As Audrey mentioned, our topic today is why building tenants should be thinking about climate risk. This is the second in a series of informative webinars targeted at business tenants and commercial buildings. The commercial real estate sector in New York region, in fact, throughout the GHTA, provides the workplace location for a significant number of businesses. They are businesses who lease space for their office, their warehousing, or distribution facilities. They are industrial, condominium, or retail shopping venues. More than likely, they are SMEs with customer-facing or B2B relationships. They are often isolated from other businesses in their building, yet they share common space and utility infrastructure, in addition to sharing the elevator. We are focused on this segment because they've been left out of the opportunity to take action on climate change, because they have the most to gain by their customers and their suppliers in being recognized for their climate action efforts, and because they are in a pivotal position to influence their building owners in the adoption of practices that contribute to reducing building GHG emissions. What they need and what we are going to provide them with is a roadmap to greenhouse gas emissions reductions, including how businesses can benefit by understanding the critical signposts as you move towards the recognition destination for their sustainability efforts. Change the slide, please. Today's topic will inform participants on select regulatory and legislative influences that will impact your workplace in the next 5 years. We are proud to have Carol Aziz, Project Director of the Climate Risk Institute, and Richard Joy, Executive Director of the Urban Land Institute, ULI, Toronto, join us today. I will introduce them in more detail later on. Next slide, please. Who we are. The Climate-Wise Building Challenge is a York region-wide friendly awards competition that is created to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from building operations through collaboration, education, and innovation. The competition is free of cost to building owners, landlords, and managers and tenants who want to join the fight to combat climate change while improving your bottom line by implementing responsible energy operations and behavioral practices. Windfall, the Climate-Wise Building Challenge, is a program supported by the Windfall Ecology Center. Windfall Ecology Center is a not-for-profit social enterprise dedicated to building sustainable communities located in York Region. In fact, we've served the local York Region community for the last 20 years. The center's activities focus on empowering communities to create lasting wealth in a carbon-constrained 21st century. Next slide, please. The webinar series uses the metaphor of a roadmap. We are on a journey. We are on a journey together, and each webinar is a signpost in the journey, pointing our listeners in the right direction to taking action on climate change. The end of the journey is the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and importantly, the recognition of your business for taking action on climate change. Today, we are focused on three main points, three main learning areas. Next slide, please. Oops, we jump one. Right. We're looking at the impacts of pending local and global policy and regulations, how climate change affects your business building operations, supply chain, and required disclosures. A lot about disclosures in the whole series of webinars the last week and upcoming in the next week. So we're very much on the forefront here. And how to develop a climate risk action plan as a tenant in a commercial building. Next slide, please. What we want to accomplish today is to inform you, to educate you, commercial building tenants, on mitigating your cost and supply risk by being more climate knowledgeable and climate resilient. We want to accomplish these. We want to introduce you to initiatives that mean to what they mean to the broader real estate industry and their commercial building tenants in the months and years ahead, and how we at the Climate-Wise Building Challenge can enable your success. Next slide, please. Our last webinar looked at the overall map. Our signpost today on that map is exploring climate resiliency for SMEs. So let's begin. Next slide, please. I'm happy to introduce Carol Aziz. Carol has over 25 years of experience directing an array of environmental and climate risk projects. Her expertise spans supporting TCFD, it's a mouthful, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, to fostering private sector partnerships on climate and engineering risk assessment projects. Thank you, Carol, for joining us today. And I want to remind you, as Audrey pointed out, we have questions after Carol's presentations and questions after Richard's presentations, who I'll introduce later on. So please capture your questions and enter them into the chat. Thanks very much, Carol. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Harry. It's really a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and excited to talk to you all about climate risk and why we should all be thinking about it. Next slide. So I have about 15 or so minutes to run through some key topics on climate risk. Oh, next slide.
Hang on one sec. Just getting loaded. Internet's a bit slow. There we go.
Okay. So we'll talk about how climate change is impacting businesses. So physical climate risk. So how it can cause physical damage, how it can disrupt businesses and supply chains. We'll touch on some Canadian regulations related to disclosing climate risks, including discussing what the TCFD is and what their recommendations are, and how small businesses might be affected by TCFD disclosures. And then I'll close with some suggestions on how to build resilience to climate risk. Next slide. So climate change. Remember years ago when you thought climate change was something we didn't have to worry about for a couple of decades? Unfortunately, climate change, we're seeing the impacts of climate change on a regular basis. Like in the news, we're hearing about heat domes and flooding and fires. Our climate is changing. The climate that we're experiencing today is very different than the climate that I grew up experiencing as a kid, and our climate will continue to change in the future. Why? Because we've been burning a lot of fossil fuels since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So burning a lot of coal, oil, and gas. And this is producing a lot of carbon dioxide, which has changed the composition of our atmosphere. It's amplifying the greenhouse effect and causing our planet to warm. So our planet is warming, and Ontario is warming at twice the global rate. We're seeing more intense rainfall and more extreme weather as a result. And so this more extreme weather has an impact on our lives and our businesses. More extreme weather can lead to more power outages, and we're likely to continue to see more physical building damage due to flooding, high winds, and ice storms. Our temperatures are going up. We're going to see more extreme heat and longer heat waves. And this can be a concern for any of you that may have outdoor workers. It will also lead to higher cooling costs, although lower heating costs. There can be access issues around extreme weather if power lines come down or trees come down or there's severe flooding. And certainly there can be supply chain disruption and loss of productivity. Next slide. So I just wanted to highlight how climate change can impact and is impacting and will impact supply chains. And this is, we've kind of got a taste of that, how supply chains can be disrupted during COVID. I don't know about you, but I've definitely had to wait a really long time for some things. I waited a really long time to get a bicycle, for example. And so we are seeing unprecedented worldwide supply chain disruptions, and climate change is predicted to cause even more disruption. And we got a taste of that last fall in November when there was the extreme rainfall event due to the atmospheric rivers that caused severe flooding and mudslides in BC, caused very bad damage to some of the key highways and railways, and basically severed our largest port from the rest of the country, exposing supply chain vulnerability. We can also have supply chain issues when workers can't get to their jobs because of the effects of extreme weather. So definitely climate change impacts are and will affect supply chains. Next slide. So our climate is changing, and so must business. And so to stay competitive, businesses must change the way they operate and embed sustainability and become more resilient to the changing climate. And as Mark Carney, shown here on the right, former governor of the Bank of England, famously said in 2019, firms that ignore the climate crisis will go bankrupt. So it is really important to think about climate and how it's going to affect your business, and to build resilience to the climate risks. And there is a business case for that, and it's around avoiding unexpected costs to business disruption and to your physical assets, to managing risks, and to making the most of opportunities. Next slide. So what are some of the Canadian regulations related to disclosing climate risks? Well, right now, Crown corporations need to disclose climate risks starting in this year if they're a large corporation with more than $1 billion in assets. And smaller Crown corporations need to disclose their climate risks as of 2024. Last fall, the G7 recommended mandatory disclosures for publicly traded companies. And just this December, federal ministers were provided letters that asked them to move towards mandatory climate-related financial disclosures and net zero plans for federally regulated institutions. Climate risk disclosure is mandatory in several other countries, including the UK, New Zealand, Switzerland, and probably soon the US. There's been a recent Security and Exchange Commission proposal just this past March for US publicly traded companies, which will likely be enacted. So very soon, US publicly traded companies will need to disclose their climate risks. Why? Why all this activity? Because investors are increasingly getting concerned and demanding disclosure, because climate risk is investment risk. And so given all these signals, it's very likely that Canadian publicly traded companies will have to disclose in the near future, and following the TCFD framework. Next slide. So what is the TCFD? The TCFD stands for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and it was established in 2015, and the committee was is led by Mike Bloomberg and Mark Carney. And the purpose of the committee was to raise awareness amongst businesses of the importance of evaluating and disclosing climate-related risks. And they developed recommendations for climate-related financial disclosures to provide decision-useful information to lenders, insurers, investors to understand how to what the implications of climate risk are on the investment. And so it started as a voluntary standard, but it's now widely adopted and is mandatory in several jurisdictions. Next slide. So TCFD, this diagram covers the kinds of risks and opportunities the TCFD likes companies to disclose. So on the risk side, they want companies to disclose their transition risks and their physical risks. Transition risks relate to risks associated with transitioning to a low carbon economy. So those can be policy related risks around increasing carbon taxes, for example, changes in technology. So transitioning to EVs instead of gas powered cars, for example, changes in the market or in the reputation of a company that doesn't transition fast enough. Physical risks, which is what I'll be discussing more today, are the risks around climate change and impacts to businesses. And those they categorize as either acute, which an example would be flooding or a hurricane, or chronic, so a slower onset like gradually rising temperatures or sea level rises. And all of those present risks to businesses. But there's also opportunities around a transition to a low carbon economy. We can be more efficient with our energy and resources, saving money. There's the room for new products and services and innovation and new markets and building resilience. So the risks and opportunities impact the bottom line of a company. And so the TCFD wants companies to assess and disclose these risks and opportunities. Next slide. And so they've provided 11 core recommendations under 4 categories. So under governance, they want to understand how the board oversees the climate-related risks and opportunities and management's role in assessing and managing risks and opportunities. They want the company, under strategy, they want the company to identify climate-related risks in the short, medium, and long term, and how that impacts the business's strategy and financial planning. And they want the company to think about how resilient their strategy is, considering various future climate scenarios. Next slide. The third category is risk management. They want the company to describe how they're identifying and assessing and managing climate-related risks and how those risks are integrated in their overall risk management process. And lastly, they want a disclosure of metrics and targets. So what metrics are being used to assess climate-related risks and opportunities? They want disclosure of scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions and scope 3 or value chain emissions if appropriate and significant. And they also want targets for climate-related risks and opportunities and performance against those targets. So how the company is doing in reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. So how may mandatory future TCFD disclosures affect small businesses? Well, first, if a small business is in the value chain of a large company that needs to disclose, then that small business could be influenced to reduce and report on their greenhouse gas emissions. Also, some medium-sized businesses are publicly traded. It's roughly 8%. So if you are a medium-sized business that's publicly traded, TCFD disclosures are likely to be mandatory in the next few years. Now, the first 2 points might not apply to many of you, but the TCFD framework still provides good recommendations on how to identify climate risks and opportunities in your own operations and take steps to minimize those risks. Next slide. So why identify physical climate risks and climate-proof your company? There's a whole host of reasons. It prepares you to minimize business interruption from power outages and extreme weather, avoids the costs of infrastructure and asset damage, reduces liability, helps build resilient supply chains, protects company reputation, and overall saves you money by being prepared for these disruptions and leads to competitive advantage. Next slide. And it should be noted that small businesses can be particularly vulnerable to climate impacts and extreme weather. There's an interesting study on the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, or ICLR's website. This study indicated that 25% of small businesses impacted by a natural disaster, such as severe flooding or hurricanes, never reopened. And that was due to the fact that many of them often lack financial resources for recovery or the ability to spread their risk across several geographic locations or ready access to alternative suppliers. So important for small businesses to think about business continuity, and there's some good resources on the ICLR's website around business continuity planning. Next slide. So what can businesses do now to get started to think about their climate risks? Well, we can kind of use the TCFD framework as a roadmap. And so the first is really around governance and appointing someone to be in charge of considering climate risks. And this should be a senior, a person in senior leadership, like an owner or a president. The leadership and the staff should be educated about climate risks and opportunities, and roles and responsibilities should be established. The company should think about how extreme weather and climate change has and is affecting the business now, and how it may impact them in the future. And put in place a process to identify, prioritize, and manage climate risks and identify opportunities. If you already have a risk management system, that's a good place to add in your climate risks. It's important to also eventually set metrics and targets to increase your resilience and reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. But most importantly, it's important to take action and get going. Next slide. So I just have a few suggestions on ways that businesses can build climate resilience. And these should be fairly useful for a variety of types of businesses. But as we've pointed out, supply chain disruption is a big risk. It's currently occurring now because of COVID, and we're expecting it to get worse as the climate changes. So some of the things you could think about to minimize.
Carol, we've got you muted for some reason.
Sorry.
There you go.
So just backing up. So these are some suggestions for how you can minimize supply chain disruption, which I mean, we're already experiencing with COVID, and will get worse as the climate warms and changes. So, you know, having the just-in-time inventory, we've seen makes businesses very vulnerable. So having some products in reserve as a buffer is one way to minimize disruptions, as well as identifying backup suppliers should your main ones fail to deliver during an extreme weather event. The other thing to consider too are power outages. We're likely to see more of those in the future due to extreme weather. So high winds or ice storms or even high temperatures. And so you should ensure that you do have backup power in your building, especially if you have temperature sensitive assets, processes, or products. It goes without saying you should be doing regular computer backups, and have remote work options, which luckily many of us do because of the pandemic. Next slide. Flooding is another big hazard in our area, and so it's important to consider how flooding may disrupt your business. Now, I know many of you are tenants, and you might be thinking, well, how, like, that's my landlord's job, but you can work with your landlord to make sure they're taking the right steps. Are they, you know, have you noticed a lot of flooding in and around your building? Has the landlord properly graded the land away from the building? Are they making sure that the catch basins are unblocked, so there's no leaves accumulating or they're piling snow there? And, do they have proper stormwater management? Another thing to consider too is how you may be storing raw or waste chemicals. If you have any kind of chemicals or fuels stored outside and there's severe weather and they spill, it can be a big liability in terms of cleanup costs. So important to consider securely storing any chemicals or fuels. Inside, you should consider whether any of your equipment is on a floor that could be vulnerable to flooding, and if so, relocate that equipment or elevate it, and also check your insurance policy to see whether you are sufficiently covered for any kind of flooding damage. So those are just a few suggestions on how you can start to build resilience to physical climate risks today, and a roadmap for how you can start the conversation in your companies. So next slide. So when this presentation gets posted, there's a number of free useful resources for you. There's there's a TCFD guidance. There's also, as I mentioned, some very good business continuity planning forms and guidance on the ICLR website. And there's a really good website for small businesses called the SME Climate Hub. It's got some great resources for assessing climate risks for small businesses. Next slide. And that's my brief presentation on physical climate risks. Yay. So happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Carol. A little bit of feedback here.
Oh dear.
How's that?
Try one more time.
Is there a problem?
Maybe.
I think so.
There we
go. It looks okay now.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're getting some feedback, so that's kind of weird as where it came from, but very, very concise, Carol. Thank you very much. Good suggestions for SMEs and what they can do. One of our key objectives for this webinar series is to educate building tenants so they could have informed discussions with their landlords, looking towards greater collaboration and taking action on climate change. So thanks very much. So while our audience warms up to some questions, I have one here for you that I thought I would raise, and then there are a few questions online that I'd like to talk. We're going to take some questions now, and then we'll move on to Richard's presentation.
Sure.
Businesses in York Region and environment are largely located in commercial buildings. Do I really have to worry about climate resiliency?
Yeah, well, I focus primarily on physical climate risks, so the impacts from extreme weather. And so those can be impacts to your business and the roads around your business, but can also be impacts in other countries. And so I really think the supply chain risk is something that businesses should be thinking about. Are they purchasing a lot of key equipment, key supplies from very vulnerable areas? So thinking about that. And certainly flooding is a big one. I mean, I know at my past employer, we were tenants and we did get some flooding. Luckily we didn't have really expensive equipment right where it was flooding, but definitely it was occurring. And so, flooding is a big issue. And so it's important to just work with your landlord to make sure they're managing the stormwater, because we are seeing and will continue to see very intense storms. I think it's also important too, as a tenant, when you go to another, when your lease is up and you go and look for another building, that you're choosing a building that is more resilient or less vulnerable. So don't pick the building next to the river, or maybe choose a floor higher up. So there's things you can do around when you move choosing buildings that would be less susceptible to flooding and severe weather.
Here's a question from our audience as well about climate disclosure in Ontario. Has there been any talk about climate disclosure at the provincial level?
I haven't heard anything about it myself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so no, at this point in time that we haven't. Okay, great. All right, well, audience, again, I remind you that we do have the opportunity for some questions as well at the end of the webinar. I will thank Carol again later on, but again, thank you now for your concise presentation. I'd like to move on to Richard at this point in time. Many of you, yeah, thank you, Carol. Great. Don't go away. You'll be back. Many of you have had the opportunity to get to know Richard through the rich webinar schedule presented by ULI. Richard is commonly quoted in papers such as the Globe and Mail on land use planning and climate change policy actions. Richard Joy is the Executive Director of the Urban Land Institute, ULI, as they're commonly known here in Toronto. Prior to joining ULI, he served as the Vice President, Policy and Government Relations at the Toronto Region Board of Trade. Richard will provide some international context of what is happening on building regulations related to greenhouse gas emission caps. He will introduce Stuart Dudfield from the City of Toronto through a video clip that Stuart recently presented at one of the informative ULI webinars on decarbonizing Toronto webinar. So thank you, Richard, for joining us today. Please go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you for the invitation to be part of this this program. Much appreciated. I'm not going to, in my bio, you didn't hear subject matter expert, because that I'm not, unlike Carol. But I do have the great privilege of putting the spotlight on a very, very large range of land use planning and development, including commercial properties, the sort of the big, large ecosystem of real estate. And what I can tell you, and what I'm going to point to in my presentation, is that there is an increasing demand for us to focus on climate and carbon related matters. It's become the dominant. In fact, I did an analysis of our 150 programs, more than 150 programs over the period of COVID, when we were forced to be all online, and nearly 50% of all of our programming and audience have tuned into what I'll describe broadly as ESG focuses, of which climate, of course, being a major piece of. And I will show you some of those programs, and I have a little surprise at the end of my presentation. But the first thing that we're going to do, I think, is just tee up a bit of a drill down. Harry mentioned international. It is true, I will have some international points to make, as this is an issue that is global, clearly. But if I could say a broader theme to what I'm going to speak to and show you is local. This is very much the climate public policy discussion or leadership is very much, I think, led at the local level, and I will give you some examples of that in a second. But it is cities that are in many ways really pushing the envelope beyond what provincial governments and federal governments are doing, and even frankly at the international level. COP26 just happened this past November, and while that did not include municipalities, because they're not involved in COP, there was a sort of a shadow conference of municipal leadership under organizations such as the C40, the largest cities in the world. And you can see really where that leadership vanguard is when you pay attention at that level. So that's probably the big point I would also make, because that's really important to you. in your location, because you'll be looking at your municipality, and I think as much as you'd be looking at the province of Ontario or the federal government. So this tees up Stuart Dutfield, as mentioned. It was part of a larger spectrum of carbon initiatives that the City of Toronto moved the needle on last year in 2021. It was a big year for the city. They moved on their own building stock. They moved on new building construction through the Green Building Standards. I think it's 4.0 of the City of Toronto. And they also, very importantly, moved on existing buildings, which is a frontier that has not really been pushed that aggressively through public policy. But we're starting to see that happening now, where existing buildings are being asked on fairly aggressive timelines to upgrade their energy profiles so as to meet emerging standards as are required. And this is the clip that Stuart Dutfield, who leads the existing buildings policy for the City of Toronto. I'm going to also be sending you the link to the entire program, which is normally behind our paywall, but I'm going to give you access through a special YouTube link that we're not making available to many people, or known to many people, but you'll be able to watch the whole entire, if this intrigues you, and I've got some other links for you as well. So let's see Stuart talk about existing buildings. It's about 8 minutes in length.
Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. I'd be remiss without sort of acknowledging some familiar names I see on the call who were really kind of key stakeholders in designing the strategy, alongside some key staff, Anna Maria Medina, Eric Stein, and Devin Stocks. So I'm going to do a lightning round on this. So as everyone knows, buildings, huge source of our emissions, about 57%. So we did a deep dive on existing buildings itself. As Cecilia said, this is a key component, obviously, of the overall net zero strategy, as it represents close to 2/3 of our emissions. Developed with the great stakeholders I mentioned before, and in a response to the climate declaration, emergency declaration in 2019. So what we tried to do with the strategy was really seek a balance between speed and feasibility, and we considered a number of things. Primary, we're looking to see how do we reduce GHG emissions, but tandem with that was the recognition that the economic implications of this are going to be massive. And so too was the realization that we needed to identify the co-benefits, which are numerous, around resilience, equity, health, and local economic development. I also put a slide up for a picture because, as a lot of people who know, our council reports, they're just the plain beats of paper. So I really encourage anyone to take a look at this, and we're happy to, we'll be engaging on this more. Next slide, please. So what does this strategy include? So there's a big bundle of materials that go to council, obviously. There's this rather, bland sort of black and white report, but this is really where a lot of the technical analysis and the modeling was done to achieving net zero by 2050. It includes a package of 9 key actions to achieve that model scenario and a high-level implementation with a plan and timelines. So given that council updated their ambition in December of this year, we're currently working through how do we sort of meet this heightened ambition and make it also, I think one of the key things we'll be doing is aiming to engage with key stakeholders in the building industry to see how we can do this. Next slide, please. So just really quickly, some key findings. I don't think these will come as a big surprise to a lot of people. What we found from our analysis of the 2 years in developing this is really that to make this a work, to meet the targets, we need to implement this. The other key thing, again, others have mentioned it, is fuel switching. We need to get off the fossil fuels and a clean electricity grid. So we need access to those things. So those are 2 of the most significant requirements. We also know that envelope upgrades are costly, but necessary to really make this work. And also, we see the greatest delivery of co-benefits coming out of that envelope work. So in terms of health, resilience, and local economic development. I think one of the things I want to emphasize with this plan is that although we recognize there's a lot of cost for this is an inherently local plan, right? The activity is going to be happening in Toronto, and if we can develop the supply chains and the workforce, this is a massive economic opportunity. Net zero emissions itself are not sort of technically and financially feasible from building retrofits alone. So we do need to look at offsets and other measures. And I think there's going to be a whole and growing industry around that as well. The other thing we realize is that, voluntary measures are not enough and mandatory requirements will be necessary. And I think that's a recognition from, building sector itself. Retrofits, obviously, significant net investment for building owners. And so we want to also help the sector move, and I'll speak to that a little later. We also recognize that we cannot do it alone. The city itself doesn't have all the money, so we're going to need to, rely on all levels of government, provincial and the federal government, to really enable this market transformation. And what we're talking about really is a market transformation. Next slide, please. So just really quickly, again, the report details these in much greater detail. The 9 actions I referenced are sort of broken up into 3 buckets. 1, setting requirements to assess building performance and create a pathway to net zero. The other is around providing that support and those resources to make the retrofits easier and more affordable and really get to scale. And the other is around, advocacy and partnerships. So I'll hone in really quickly on the first bucket. Again, we will be looking to require annual emissions performance reporting and public disclosure for all buildings, both residential, commercial, etc. In the market already, many of you will be well aware of EWRB, the Energy, Water and Reporting Benchmarking, but we'll also be looking at how do we roll this out for single-family homes, which there are more than 400,000. We will be looking to establish performance targets. Again, as Cecilia mentioned, this is a big push, and it's actually key to this strategy is doing that. The other is around energy and emissions audits and tune-ups and developing programs to support that. We will be looking to provide integrated retrofit supports, and there are some programs available that we are looking to scale. We're also looking to expand and enhance retrofit financing. The city does have some programs in that area, but we're also hoping to, hopefully this year, make a few more announcements about some other opportunities. Working with colleagues in other divisions, we want to support the permitting and approvals process to make this easier for deep retrofits. Overall, again, thank you very much, ULI, for the invitation. We want to make home and building owners aware that this is coming. I think the most important thing we want to socialize is that, a massive societal shift is required in terms of decarbonization. And we've got 18 years to do it. I know scientists say we have a lot less, in many ways, we should have started a lot sooner, but this is where we are. So there is a massive push on that. We also recognize that a massive workforce training and development is needed, and so huge opportunity for people coming into the sector. And again, I think we're all individually and collectively going to be advocating for action at other levels of government. Next slide, please. So really quickly, I'm not going to dive into the details here. These are the top 3 actions around performance targets and disclosure. I think in the short term, we're looking at a voluntary rollout of this beginning in 2022 to 2024, transitioning to mandatory 2025 and onward. What we're now looking into is how we effectively get this done. So again, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We will be setting up secondary stakeholder groups to sort of advise on this process. The voluntary phase was designed with the thinking that we need to consult with industry and key stakeholders to figure out how this is going to work before we transition to mandatory. So I think there's going to be lots of exciting conversations and opportunities to chat there. Next slide, please. So really quickly, I think I'll do this in the next 30 seconds. Implementation and next steps. So EED will lead the detailed design and implementation planning for the council-approved recommendations. Again, delighted to work with great colleagues like Cecilia and Lisa and Howlin and others, because it really is going to be it's going to be an all-of-government approach to it. As I mentioned before, key focus this year on the analysis for the introduction of those voluntary pieces and the transition. So I think there's going to be a lot of internal and external stakeholder engagement to make this work. Very big thing for us, obviously, is the analysis of the equity and housing affordability impacts and the development of how this all works out with the strategies. So this is top of mind for us. It's been flagged internally and externally. But how do we work to mitigate the negative impacts and really enable those positive impacts for equity deserving communities? And then we're going to be looking at supporting building owners through existing programs and new programs, which again, we hope to be able to announce soon. Better Buildings Partnership, a number of initiatives there. Please contact us if you'd like to learn more. We'll be doing a series of webinars throughout the year. Our energy retrofit loan is one example. The Green Will Initiative is another. We have 22 building owners and portfolios engaged in that so far and hoping to grow that. Navigation Support Services, which provides technical support to buildings looking to, again, get on this pathway to net zero. And then on the residential side, Alberta Homes PO initiative and Home Energy Loan Program, which we're also hoping to make some exciting announcements about this year. So I will leave it at that. And again, thank you very much, everyone. Look forward to the discussion.
Great. I'm gonna share, if I could, just 3 quick slides, if that's all right, including some of the other programming that we've done that I will provide links for. So if I could, I think you may need to take.
I'll take mine down, Richard.
Okay.
Now
so
give that a try.
Are you seeing? Okay. One thing I wanted to add to what Carol was saying in terms of other reasons you might be thinking about. I mean, one is carbon pricing is constantly on the rise. On April 1st, it went up to 50 cents, and it's just going to continue to rise. And that we all know that carbon pricing was a favored policy of economists and public policy makers, as it really, you can't escape it. And so where policies in the past might have been more targeted, carbon pricing is, and it's not just in our cars, it's everything that where we consume carbon. And then of course, I mean, geopolitics is, I think, only going to keep the pressure on those who might see backslipping for whatever reason. We're tired of fighting the carbon, pursuing a carbon agenda. The point of Mark Carney, another famous quote of his was the tragedy of the horizon. The idea that governments and public don't necessarily see things that they feel are far off on the horizon, even though climate clearly is no longer that kind of a thing. These are things that are just ever present on the whole climate file, that none of us can escape these things. The next slide, if I can figure out how to move my slide. These are some of the programs that we have done. I mentioned a number of programs we've done in the last year or so. These are a few of the examples, and I'll just point out a couple that make my point about the local. David Miller, the former mayor of Toronto, is now with the organization that I mentioned, C40 Cities. He's written an excellent book that I commend. I really enjoyed it, called How the World's Great Cities Are Fixing the Climate Crisis, making my point about cities being on the leadership. We did a program that featured the leadership of Houston, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, and New York City, as giving you examples of that urban leadership. And then another one that I will point out is New York City's Local Law 97. This is very much, you've heard of the Green New Deal, in the politics of the U.S. Not exactly embraced at the federal level, but at the local level, the Green New Deal manifested itself in one way, and that is through the New York Law 97, Local Law 97, which is the most aggressive North American municipal policy-led standards for carbon reduction in existing buildings. And this is New York that's doing this. So Toronto's not alone. In fact, in many ways, Toronto's following and catching up to cities like New York. Across the GTA, I think you can expect that bar will continue to rise. It goes beyond, in some cases, these things are set through provincial policies like building codes and so forth. Cities are able to go beyond those provincial and national standards, and they are doing that. And I think you're going to continue to see that happening. And I will send those links. And that's what you'll get a page that'll look something like this, a link that'll take you to a YouTube page that'll look something like this, and that'll be where you can find these additional programs if you're interested. So with that, I'm going to hopefully not stop sharing, and I will stop there.
Okay, so you get us back on the slides, Audrey, when we're ready. Thanks very much, Richard, and let me thank you right offhand for sharing the link to the Decarbonizing Toronto webinar, the full webinar, and these other resources. They're wonderful resources, and clearly an indication of ULI's willingness to share information so that others can take advantage of some of the wonderful information that is there. Questions from the audience again, take a look at our chat box. Oh, by the way, I also want to mention that Windfall Ecology Centre was actually involved in the development of the Toronto strategy. Brent Copson, our executive director, focused on the residential component, and some of the learnings from that, particularly the building archetypes, are now being taken out to a project we have for residential buildings in the region of Durham. So already some synergies are happening, but it makes me really wonder, the question that comes to my mind is, how much do you think, Richard, this kind of approach that Toronto is taking, that you've made reference to in New York, is going to be adopted by municipalities such as the region of York? I don't expect small municipalities to be doing a lot of it just yet, but Peel, York, they're all well-heeled organizations and have a lot of capital buildings. Do you think this will start to trickle down to them?
Absolutely. I know we have a very short amount of time, and you got some great questions for Carol. So I'll just say that I absolutely get that sense. I think that we're seeing incredible progressive leadership across the 905 and even into the 519 on a whole range of public policy fronts. And this is one I think the city of Toronto is almost always, just by the fact that it has the larger policy capacity, is the pioneer, but very quickly, and this includes many things like inclusionary zoning on the rental side and things like that are happening right now. Toronto's at the front end, but everybody pretty much soon follow. So I think what you're seeing in Toronto, absolutely, you can expect across the GTA. Great.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that, and we'll just check our question list here before I go on to my rest of my slides here. Carol, another question here for you about how, well, now it's voluntary for the TCFD and various other standards. Do you see this becoming mandatory, and when?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, all the signals are there. We've got crown corporations that need to disclose now or in a couple of years. The feds have signaled that federally regulated organizations need to disclose soon. The US is probably going to approve their SEC proposal this year. So yes, I think TCFD is going to be mandatory in Canada. It's just a question of when, and I would think in the next year or two, it's going to be mandatory. So companies, publicly traded companies, need to get prepared. And even if you're not, as I tried to point out, even if you're not publicly traded, it's important to think about your climate risks. And so I focused on the physical climate risks, but there's also the transition risks, right? So that would include increasing carbon taxes. Maybe you have some products or services that aren't going to be as used in the future as we transition to a low carbon economy. So you might see a reduction in your business. And then thinking about your opportunities, there's lots of opportunities in the low carbon economy, and I guess that was demonstrated very well around energy efficiency and deep energy retrofits. Is going to be a huge opportunity. So just thinking about how that the risks and opportunities affect your business and taking action on that.
Right. Okay, I'm going to take the last couple of minutes to close out on our Time-Wise Building Challenge, but I'm going to ask Richard one more time, and I'll do it, an interview saying 30 seconds or less, or 10 seconds or less, as they always give these complicated questions. How is this going to trickle down to building owners and building commercial tenants from a cost perspective, these policies, and how do you think they're going to react to it?
I don't know if I have an answer exactly for that, other than it's coming. I just think it's an unavoidable cost that will be coming, and so I think the answer will reveal itself, I think, through your diligence in monitoring the landscape, the public policy landscape, but to think it's not coming would not be good planning. So that's the best answer I can give you, I'm afraid.
Great answer. Thanks very much again, both Carol and Richard, for your very entertaining and educative sessions and presentations today. We appreciate the very practical suggestions and illustrations of what SMEs can do and what the impacts are going to be for them. ClimateWise Building Challenge is here to support building owners and tenants in New York region through our challenge. We'll help you understand what the greenhouse gas emissions is in your buildings through our Energy Star Portfolio Manager. We'll help you develop an action plan to be able to manage your emissions and reduce your emissions to be part of a movement, including energy tips, benchmarking tools, and advice for industry leaders. Next slide. You can expect lots of benefits if you get involved with the challenge. Certainly the practical and usually upfront cost savings, stay on top of incentives and trends that are happening that Richard just mentioned. We know that employees are really interested in working for top tier employers who are doing the right thing in terms of taking action on climate change. This is a way of engaging employees in your company, in your business, on your floor, of working with your other business owners and business tenants. And as I said earlier on in my comment, building a movement towards net zero in Canada. Next slide. There's a den to the journey, and we are working right now with Natural Resources Canada to build a tenant space recognition program that parallels the EPA's program in the States. More about that in coming webinars, but there are some clear benefits for you as a building owner to encourage your tenants to get involved and to be part of that movement, to join us on this pathway and on that roadmap. And we hope to have that through a pilot project going on now and in place by the spring of 2023. Audrey? Watch for our upcoming webinar series again on May, first week in May, June, and then in September, October, November. I won't get into the details, but green leases, better understanding and how to measure your consumption through submetering. Next slide. A lot of people have joined our ClimateWise Business Challenge now. 407 ETR, CompuGen, all of the York Region municipalities are part of the challenge and have offered up their buildings to be part of this free and friendly competition. Next slide. So take a look at our resources on our website. There's lots of information there, the ClimateWise Business Network and the ClimateWise Building Challenge, and we're available to help you if you're a constituent in the regional municipality of York. Next slide. Thanks very much again, Richard and Carol, and we look forward to checking out your information, Richard, and to hearing more about some of the links that you've sent us, Carol. So thank you very much again, and take care, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Just a note, the presentation done by Carol and this presentation of our deck will be available for download, as well as to be able to watch the recording. That should be on our website within the next week.
Okay.
Thanks
very much, Audrey.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. So maybe it's continuing to record because it would deal with power outages, let's say. And I'm going to stop the recording.